There is a particular kind of darkness that lives inside old cities. Not the ordinary darkness of switched-off street lamps or overcast skies, but something heavier, something with memory. The kind of darkness that has watched centuries pass through it. That has absorbed wars and whispers, and the sound of things dying quietly between the walls of buildings no architect ever truly designed for the living. It pools at the corners of cobblestone streets. It breathes through the cracks in underground tunnels. And in certain cities, the ones that tourists never linger in after midnight, the ones where cab drivers always seem to know which roads to avoid, that darkness has a purpose. It is not empty. It is occupied. The war had been going on for longer than most human civilizations had existed. You would not know it walking through those streets. You would see only rain. The kind of rain that falls sideways in early October, that soaks through every layer you own and leaves you feeling smaller than you intended to feel when you stepped outside. You might hear something distant, the low rumble that you would assume was thunder, or construction, or someone's music vibrating through a shared wall. You would not think battle. You would not think centuries-old blood feud being settled 3 floors below your feet in an abandoned transit tunnel. You would simply pull your collar up and walk faster. That was the gift the old ones had cultivated over hundreds of years. Not just power, not just the ability to bend shadows or run faster than headlights or endure wounds that would turn a human body into a ruin. The real gift was invisibility. Not supernatural invisibility, social invisibility. The art of existing in the spaces humans preferred not to examine. The architecture of the unseen. On one side of that war, vampires, old blood, aristocratic in their cruelty. They had built their hierarchy slowly over centuries, layering power over power the way a glacier layers ice, slowly, invisibly, with enormous and patient weight. They believed in hierarchy because hierarchy had served them. They believed in control because control was the only thing that had kept them alive this long. They operated through covens and councils and ancient rites conducted in chambers so old the stone walls no longer remembered being cut. On the other side, Lycans, something rawer, something that remembered being hunted, being enslaved, being kept as a weapon rather than acknowledged as a race. The wound of that history had never healed. It had calcified instead, become something structural, a rage that functioned like architecture, holding everything together through the sheer force of its own density. Lycans did not build hierarchies. They built survival. They built defenses. And on certain nights they built offensives. This particular night was an offensive night, but something else was moving through the rain. Nobody noticed it at first. Not the Lycan sentries in the tunnels, monitoring the grid of old maintenance corridors they had mapped and memorized over years. Not the vampire patrol cars moving silently through the residential streets 2 kilometers away. Black vehicles with no plates and tinted windows and drivers who had not blinked in 40 minutes. Not the few humans still awake in the buildings above, insomniacs, late-shift workers, people staring at phone screens with the particular numbness of those who have given up on sleep. The first sign was the temperature. A block to the east, something registered as heat. Not body heat. Not the warmth of an engine or an industrial exhaust vent. This was different, intense, localized, and climbing. It moved. It did not radiate outward the way a fire does. It tracked. It had direction. It had intent. The air it passed through did not simply warm, it shivered, the way air shivered before something immense and unavoidable. And then came the sound. The dragging of metal across wet asphalt, rhythmic and deliberate. The growl of an engine that sounded like it was running on something other than combustion. And then the light. Deep, unearthly orange, flickering against the rain and the brick walls and the edges of fire escapes 3 stories up. It rounded a corner at the end of the street, and for 1 full second the city simply stopped. Not metaphorically. The rain seemed to hang. The distant sounds of the underground battle paused. Even the wind appeared to reconsider its direction. A motorcycle. Or the shape of one, a shape that fire and fury had assembled into something that resembled a motorcycle the way a thunderstorm resembles a glass of water. The wheels left burning trails on the wet road that did not immediately vanish. The engine sound was not a sound at all. Not really, it was closer to a declaration. And above the handlebars where a rider's face should have been, there was a skull. White bone, clean and ancient, wreathed in fire that burned without consuming hellfire. the kind that does not obey the laws of chemistry or physics or anything humans had ever written in a textbook. It burned because it meant to. It burned because something had sent it to burn. Ghost Rider had arrived. In the underworld, nothing that moved in the dark was innocent. Both the vampires and the Lycans understood this because both of them were products of it. Power, survival, dominance, these were the only currencies that mattered here. They had fought each other for generations with the grim understanding that their world was a closed system. Nothing entered it from outside. Nothing could. And now, through the rain and the dark and the occupied silence of that ancient city, something had. It did not hunt for blood. It did not hunt for territory or power or the satisfaction of dominance. It was not a predator in any sense that either faction had a word for. Both sides, in their centuries of existence, had encountered things that frightened them. More powerful Lycans, hunters with knowledge they should not have possessed. But not this. This was something far older than either of them had anticipated. Something that did not arrive because it was hungry. Something that arrived because it had been sent. And the reason it had been sent was the one thing neither vampires nor Lycans had ever truly reckoned with in all their centuries of surviving and killing and ruling the dark. Their sins. The tunnel raid had been 3 months in the planning. The vampire coven known inside intelligence circles as the Eastern Assembly had coordinated 17 operatives, 4 of them elders, century-marked and formidably powerful, and 13 younger soldiers trained in the precise, cold-blooded methodology that the Assembly had refined over 200 years of wet work. Their target was a Lycan stronghold embedded beneath the city's old industrial district in a network of converted maintenance shafts and reinforced chambers that the Lycans had built incrementally over the past decade. By the Assembly's intelligence, the stronghold housed somewhere between 40 and 60 Lycans, including 3 of the Lycan faction's most important surviving strategists. The objective was elimination, not negotiation. The Assembly had long since stopped pretending that peace was a realistic outcome of this war. Peace was something humans fantasized about. Immortals understood that war was simply the natural state of things given enough time. You did not end it, you managed it. And right now, management required reducing the Lycan command structure by 3 critical figures. The operatives entered the tunnel system at precisely 2:17 in the morning. The Lycans predictably were ready for them. They were always ready. That was the thing about Lycans that vampires chronically underestimated, not their strength, which was obvious and acknowledged, but their patience. Their ability to sit in absolute stillness inside a dark space and wait and wait and wait, without the restlessness that immortality tends to breed in creatures accustomed to comfort. Lycans were not accustomed to comfort. They were accustomed to endurance. The tunnel was a trap, and 17 vampires walked into it with the cool confidence of those who had never once, in their centuries of existence, encountered something they could not eventually outlast. The ambush ignited like a triggered mechanism, Lycans dropping from ceiling passages, close-quarters combat in narrow concrete corridors. The sounds of it were ugly, the crack of bone, the hiss of silver-coated blades, the guttural register of things that could not be mistaken for human sounds in any acoustic context. 2 of the younger vampires went down in the first 30 seconds. The 4 elders formed a perimeter, moving with the unhurried precision of those who had survived enough chaos to stop fearing it. Neither side noticed the heat, not at first. The tunnel was already warm bodies, exertion, the friction of violence in a confined space. The first anomaly was the light, a faint orange glow at the far end of the eastern corridor, where the tunnel connected to an old service access ramp that surfaced behind a decommissioned tram station. One of the Lycan fighters registered it and turned, confused. The light was growing, and it was accompanied by sound, that deep, metallic dragging, that engine growl that did not sound mechanical in any way the fighter's instincts recognized. Then the wall at the far end of the tunnel ceased to be a wall. The motorcycle did not slow. It entered through concrete and rebar and decades of institutional grime as though they were suggestions rather than barriers, and the hellfire that surrounded it did not dim for a single second in the transition from outside air to underground space. It filled the corridor with light that had no business existing, orange and gold and a deep, sulphurous white at its core, and it illuminated both sides of the war with equal, indifferent clarity. Vampires and lycans, frozen in the sudden light, their violence arrested mid-motion, their centuries of instinct offering them absolutely nothing useful to do with what they were seeing. Ghost Rider did not pause. He moved through them the way a verdict moves through a courtroom, certain, final, and entirely without interest in what the accused might prefer. A chain, impossibly long and wreathed in fire, swept outward from his form and took 3 lycans off their feet simultaneously, sending them into the tunnel wall with a force that left craters in the reinforced concrete. A vampire elder old enough to have lived through the fall of Constantinople lunged for the rider with the full velocity of his accumulated centuries, and Ghost Rider caught him by the throat with one hand and held him in the air like a question he was about to answer. The elder burned, not the way things burned in fire. The way things burned when the fire understood what they were. The other vampires scattered. 3 of them made it to the surface access points. 2 of the remaining elders chose to fight a decision they revised immediately upon encountering the chain for the second time. The Lycans, for their part, were not faring better. Their physical resilience, the thing that made them formidable against vampires, against hunters, against almost everything that had ever tried to kill them, registered to Ghost Rider as approximately irrelevant. Hellfire did not negotiate with regeneration. It was not interested in the biological resilience of the creature in front of it. It was interested in what that creature had done. In 40 seconds, a 3 months planned assassination operation had been reduced to nothing. What replaced it was simpler and much harder to recover from: absolute primal terror. The Lycans who survived retreated into their deeper chambers, pressing against walls and staring toward the corridor where the lights still burned. The surviving vampires who made it to the surface ran not tactically, not with the measured withdrawal of professionals acknowledging a failed mission, but with the raw instinct of things that understood, at some deep cellular level, that they were in the presence of something that operated entirely outside their known world's rules. The Eastern Assembly's operatives, creatures that had survived centuries of warfare, who had faced true death countless times and turned away from it with aristocratic composure, ran through the rain-slick streets of the city like they were afraid of the dark. For the first time in generations, both factions shared something: not territory, not ideology, not even mutual hatred, which had always been the one constant they could rely on. Word spread the way it always does among immortals, not through the usual channels of scouts and informants and encrypted communications, but through something older. Instinct. The particular cold sensation that ripples through a species that has survived long enough to develop a collective nervous system of threat response. By morning, every major coven in the city knew something had entered the Eastern Assembly's tunnels. By the following evening, they knew what it had done there. By the time the sun set the day after, the question that occupied every council chamber and lycan war room and blood-soaked planning table in the city was not what it was. It was what could be done about it. The vampires tried first, not the foot soldiers, the elders. This was, in their assessment, a matter that required the application of genuine power, and genuine power was something only age could provide in their world. An elder vampire was not simply an older version of a younger one. They were a different order of being. Their speed exceeded anything biological justification could account for. Their strength had passed beyond the measurable. Some of them had developed abilities that defied categorization: sensory manipulation, psychic pressure, the ability to walk in and out of human perception like stepping through a curtain. They were, by any reasonable measure, apex predators of the supernatural world. The eldest of the Eastern Assembly convened in a private chamber that had not been entered in 40 years. 3 of them. Each had survived long enough to personally remember things that the others only knew as history. Their names were not the kind of names you said aloud carelessly. They carried weight the way old weapons carry weight through the accumulated knowledge of everything they had passed through. They dispatched 6 of their most capable 2 elders among them to intercept Ghost Rider and determine his weakness. The encounter lasted less than 4 minutes. What they discovered was not a weakness. What they discovered was the Penance Stare. The elder they called Varus moved first because Varus had never encountered anything that could not be outlasted or outmaneuvered. He had 340 years of experience to draw on. He had survived purges and revolutions and inquisitions and the particular cruelty of his own kind. He was not frightened of pain. He was not frightened of death. He had looked at both so many times that they had become familiar, almost comfortable presences at the edges of his existence. He approached Ghost Rider with the steady calm of someone walking toward an inevitable conclusion they had already made peace with. Ghost Rider stopped, not because Varys was a threat. The stop was something else entirely. It was recognition. It was the pause of something that had found what it came for. The skull turned. The hellfire blue eyes of something that was not simply a creature but a conduit, a channel through which something ancient and implacable looked out at the world, fixed on Varys with an attention that was more like gravity than sight. And then the Penance Stare opened. 340 years of guilt arrived in Varys's mind simultaneously. Not the memory of his guilt, the guilt itself, immediate and physical and total, every act of cruelty and predation and betrayal and calculated suffering. Every life he had ended or broken or simply discarded across 3.5 centuries returned to him not as thought, but as experience. He felt every one of them at once. The compacted weight of every sin he had committed across more than 300 years, pressed into a single moment that lasted, from the outside, about 11 seconds. When it ended, Varys was on the floor, not dead, not physically damaged in any visible way. Simply evacuated. Something essential had been removed from him or confronted in him with such force that the rest of his architecture had simply shut down around the wound. He would not recover quickly. He might not fully recover. The other 5 operatives witnessing this responded with everything they had. It was not enough. But what happened next was interesting, because interesting is what it was not in the way that a puzzle is interesting, but in the way that an anomaly is interesting. Something that does not fit the expected pattern. The Lycans reacted differently. 2 Lycan fighters who had been tracking Ghost Rider from a distance, operating on the orders of their strategists to observe and report rather than engage, made the error of engaging when they saw the vampires fail. Their reasoning was territorial and instinctual. If the vampires were being destroyed, the smart move was to position themselves favorably with whatever was doing the destroying, or at least demonstrate that they were not the primary enemy. The logic was sound in the context of their war. In the context of Ghost Rider, it was irrelevant. But the Penance Stare, when it fixed on the first Lycan fighter, produced something different from what it had produced with Varys. The Lycan buckled. It experienced pain, genuine, deep. The stare was not without effect, but it did not collapse. It pushed back against it, not through intellect or will in any refined sense, but through something rawer. Something that existed below the level of guilt as a concept. Lycans did not process their violence through the architecture of moral framework the way vampires did. Vampires had built elaborate systems of justification over their centuries, hierarchies, codes, traditions, and those systems created the infrastructure through which guilt could accumulate and compound. Lycans moved more directly. Their cruelty was real, their damage was real, but it lived closer to survival instinct than to deliberate sin. The Penance Stare could still reach them, but it had to reach further. And that distance, the gap between the power of the stare and the nature of its target, was the first real variable in this equation. The first suggestion that Ghost Rider's judgment, absolute as it was, did not operate with perfect uniformity across every creature it encountered. Something noted this. Something inside the flame that was not simply instinct, but was not quite thought either, registered the imbalance. Filed it. Continued forward. Selene had been watching for 4 nights. This was not unusual for her. Selene had built her existence around observation, the long, patient accumulation of information before action, the discipline of watching long enough that what you saw eventually told you something true, rather than something merely immediate. As a death dealer, she had operated in the space between knowledge and violence for so long that the two had become almost indistinguishable for her. She did not act without knowing, and she did not know without watching. She watched Ghost Rider from distance. Rooftops primarily. She was good at rooftops, the elevated position, the clear sight lines, the way the wind-up there carried information without the cluttered interference of street-level noise. She had watched the tunnel incident through a remote feed. She had watched the Elder assessment attempt in person from a distance of approximately 300 meters, with field glasses that cost more than most human beings earned in a year, and with a mind that had been sharpening itself against the grindstone of this war for centuries. She watched the way he moved, or the way the entity moved. She had already stopped thinking of it as simply a man on a motorcycle, if she had ever made that error at all. It moved with purpose. That was the first thing that distinguished it from every other dangerous thing she had encountered. Most dangerous things moved with hunger or anger or the particular mechanical efficiency of well-trained killers following an objective. Ghost Rider moved the way a storm moved, not toward any specific thing, but according to a logic that was entirely internal and entirely complete. It was not looking for targets. It was finding what was already marked. She noted the pattern of its route through the city. Not random. Not the systematic grid of a patrol. Something more complex, as though it was following a map only it could read. A geography of guilt rather than geography of streets. It moved toward density. Toward places where old sin had accumulated the way sediment accumulated at the bottom of standing water. The old assembly tower. The tunnels beneath the financial district where the Lycans had maintained a blood supply chain for a decade. The private club in the northern quarter that had been functioning as a feeding ground for the younger vampires for 30 years, protected by money and influence and the assumption that certain things were simply invisible. He was not working from intelligence gathered in the field. He was working from something that preceded field intelligence entirely. This disturbed her more than his power did. She could calculate power. She had spent her entire existence calibrating the power of things that wanted to kill her or use her or both, and she was very good at it. Power had dimensions: speed, strength, endurance, special capabilities, weaknesses, limits. You mapped it and you found its edges, and then you worked from the edges inward. Every powerful thing she had encountered in her centuries had edges. She could not find his edges. Not because they weren't there. She was disciplined enough to assume that everything had limits, because nothing she had ever observed in the mechanics of the supernatural world suggested otherwise, but because she could not find the angle from which to begin looking. He did not behave like a predator, so predator logic did not apply. He did not behave like a weapon, so the logic of command and deployment did not apply. He behaved like a principle, and principles did not have edges in the way that creatures did. She came down from the rooftops on the fourth night, not because she had decided to make contact. Selene rarely decided things impulsively. She came down because the pattern of his movement told her that he would come to her, not specifically to her, not because he knew who she was or had targeted her in particular, but because the path he was walking would eventually cross the path of her accumulated history. She had done enough over her centuries as a death dealer to be findable by something that found through guilt. She met him in a street that had no name on any current map. Wet cobblestones, high walls on both sides. The orange light arriving before he did, bending around the corner and filling the space with warmth that had nothing to do with comfort. She stood in the center of the street and waited. She did not draw her weapons, not because she had decided not to, but because she understood immediately that weapons were not the relevant variable here. She stood the way she had stood in front of threats for centuries. Present. Ghost Rider stopped 10 meters from her. There was a silence between them that lasted longer than was comfortable and shorter than it felt. Selene looked at the skull and the fire and the chains and felt no fear she had. Managed fear out of herself through sheer accumulated exposure, but she felt something else. Recognition of a kind. Not recognition of this specific entity, but recognition of the category. She had met things that operated outside the war before. Older things. Things that remembered the world before the factions. None of them had been like this. The skull tid, the fire pulse, and in the glow of it, Selene saw the Penance Stare beginning to form, that particular quality of attention that was not looking at her but into her, through the surface of her into the architecture of what she had built and destroyed across her centuries. She did not look away. Whatever he saw in her, and there was much to see, much to weigh, much that would not feel comfortable under the light of absolute judgment, he saw all of it. And she let him see it. Not passively, not helplessly, but deliberately. Because Selene had always believed that the first step to surviving something was understanding it. And she could not understand what he was unless she felt what it felt like to be seen by it. The guilt was real. She had always known that. She was not a creature who lied to herself about what she was. But she was still standing. There is a thing that happens to power when it has existed long enough without encountering anything it cannot absorb or overcome. It stops being alert. Not careless. Exactly, the very old were never careless. They had survived too much to afford carelessness, but something subtler. Something closer to the way a city that has never been besieged eventually stops maintaining its walls. Not from neglect, but from the gradual, accumulated assumption that the walls are a formality, that nothing will ever truly test them. The eldest of the vampire world had held this assumption for a very long time. They were not the Eastern Assembly elders. The Eastern Assembly, for all its centuries and arrogance, was middle management by the standards of the oldest bloodlines. The true elders, the ones whose ages were calculated not in centuries but in something that pushed against the edges of recorded history. The ones who existed in the most protected and inaccessible locations, who communicated through channels that bore no resemblance to anything the modern world would recognize. These were different. They had built the architecture of vampire society. They were the architecture, covenants, hierarchies, the rules of predation and concealment, the complex diplomatic machinery that kept the war with the Lycans from ever becoming so visible that the human world noticed. All of this was their construction, the thing they had built their entire existence around. They gathered when the reports reached them. Not in a council chamber, not around a table with the theatrical formality that the younger elders preferred. They gathered the way truly ancient things gathered, in silence, in proximity, in the shared experience of processing information that required the full weight of their accumulated centuries to make sense of. What they processed was this: something was in the city, something that could not be killed with conventional means, something that had broken their most capable elder within 11 seconds, something that moved with purpose through the architecture of their hidden world as though the architecture did not exist. Something that did not eat, did not sleep, did not maintain a territory, did not pursue power or survival or any objective that they had a framework for predicting. Something that needed only one thing, and they had given it that thing in vast, centuries-deep abundance. The vampire who spoke first, they thought of her as the first voice, which was not her name but was the closest approximation of her role in their gathered silence, said what all of them were already thinking. This could not be destroyed by force. They had tested that hypothesis vigorously, and the results were unambiguous. It could not be negotiated with, because it did not operate within any system of interest or exchange that negotiation could leverage. It could not be hidden from, because it did not find through conventional means, it found through sin. And their sin was not something they could put in a box and slide under a floor. What remained was disruption. Not of the entity itself, disruption at the level of its operating environment. Ghost Rider was not attacking them from outside their world. He was moving through their world, through the physical and social geography they had built and maintained, which meant that the geography itself was potentially a tool. If you could not fight the storm directly, you could potentially redirect it, alter the conditions it moved through, create obstacles not to its power, but to its navigation. What they needed was chaos. Controlled chaos, which was, in the vampire lexicon, not a contradiction but a specialty. Introduce enough complexity into the urban environment. Trigger multiple crises simultaneously across the city. Force the entity to divide its attention or fail to divide it and thereby reveal the limits of its focus. Create enough noise in the signal that the signal began to lose coherence. It was a cold plan. The kind of plan that would cost lives, human lives, lycan lives, the lives of their own lower-order soldiers in large numbers. But the elders had never hesitated before a plan that required sacrifice at the lower levels of the hierarchy. That was, in many ways, what lower levels existed for. But underneath the planning, underneath the cold mechanical process of strategy, something else was happening in the chamber where the first voice and the others gathered. Something that would not be acknowledged verbally, because acknowledging it verbally would have required a kind of self-examination that the eldest vampires had spent centuries carefully avoiding. They were afraid. Not the tactical fear of predators facing a dangerous target. They had managed that kind of fear into a useful tool long ago. This was different. The fear that comes not from facing something dangerous, but from facing something that is specifically calibrated to you. Something that does not simply threaten your survival, but threatens the entire framework through which your survival has been justified. The vampire elders had built magnificent structures of self-justification over their millennia. They had decided, somewhere in the deep past of their existence, that what they were was simply what the world required them to be, that their predation was inevitable, that their war was natural, that their sins, and they knew at some level they preferred not to visit, that they had committed sins were simply the cost of existing at the top of an immovable hierarchy. Ghost Rider did not care about hierarchies. Ghost Rider did not find immovable hierarchies interesting as a concept. He found sin interesting, and they were made of it. The plan for disruption and chaos was approved. Preparations began. And in the deepest chamber of the oldest coven in the city, a vampire who had watched empires rise and fall and who had never, in all of those centuries, experienced a night where the dark felt genuinely threatening, sat in the silence after the others had departed and felt, with a clarity that centuries had not diminished, the first stirrings of something that resembled dread. Not dread of dying, dread of being seen. The Lycan War Council met in the deep structure of what the humans above called an abandoned foundry. It was not abandoned. It had been systematically converted, over a decade of careful and unglamorous work, into something that served the Lycan cause far better than any glamorous headquarters could have, a fortified command node disguised as disuse. The kind of place that human eyes slid off of, that municipal planners forgot to include in demolition schedules, that existed in the comfortable blind spot between visible decay and invisible function. They met without the theatrical trappings that the vampires favored for their councils. No carved chairs, no architectural symbolism. Folding tables, monitors, maps, and the particular tension of a room full of people who had been at war long enough that urgency was simply their baseline state. The debate was not about whether to engage Ghost Rider. That argument had been tried and discarded in the first 5 minutes of the meeting, because the empirical evidence from every engagement to date was unambiguous on the subject of direct confrontation. The debate was about what angle of resistance remained available to them given that fact. Their strategists were, in certain important ways, more pragmatic than the vampires. The vampire elders approached Ghost Rider as a political problem, something to be managed, redirected, made to serve or at least not harm their interests. The Lycans approached him as what he actually was, a superior force that needed to be survived. These were not the same problem, and the Lycan approach to survival had centuries of hard-won refinement behind it. What they had observed and observed carefully, because observation was one of the few advantages available to the structurally weaker party in any conflict, was the differential response. The Penance Stare had broken Varus in 11 seconds. Their own fighters, in 2 separate documented encounters, had lasted longer. Not indefinitely, not comfortably, but longer. The implication was structural, not personal. Lycan psychology, the way it processed the relationship between action and guilt, created a different interface with Ghost Rider's primary weapon. This was not a weapon. This was a characteristic. But characteristics could be leveraged. What followed was the closest thing to a military assault that the Lycan faction had mounted in decades. 60 fighters, drawn from every cell in the city. Selected not for age or status, but for specific psychological profiles, the fighters who had functioned longest in the war, whose relationship with their own violence was most thoroughly integrated, least likely to fracture under the pressure of the Penance Stare. Fighters whose guilt, if it existed in the form Ghost Rider's power required, was buried deepest. They hit him in the old industrial corridor at the city's southeastern edge, 3 kilometers from any residential district, in a location selected specifically for the structural options it provided: multiple approach vectors, significant overhead cover, materials that could be used as barrier and projectile and obstacle. The first wave was physical. They came at him in numbers and speed, using the pack coordination that Lycan groups had developed over generations of working together, not the trained unit coordination of human military forces, but something more organic, more responsive, operating on a semi-instinctual level that human tactical doctrine had no real analog for. They hit him from 4 directions simultaneously. They maintained mobility rather than fixed position, cycling in and out of contact to prevent him from focusing on any single target. The hellfire absorbed it. Not in the sense of being unaffected even at the scale of Ghost Rider's power. 60 coordinated fighters created real friction, real cost, real complexity. The chain moved constantly, describing arcs through the industrial space that burned orange-white wherever it touched concrete or steel or flesh. Lycans went down. Not all of them, and not immediately, but steadily the arithmetic of the encounter resolving in one direction with the patient certainty of something that could not be argued with. But some of them survived contact longer than the models predicted. A lycan called Reza, whose background included 15 years of continuous combat and a psychological architecture that his commanders described as essentially impenetrable, closed within arm's reach of Ghost Rider and held the proximity for 7 seconds before the hellfire drove him back. 7 seconds in physical contact range of Ghost Rider was, in the context of every previous encounter documented, an extraordinarily long time. He had not broken under the beginning of the Penance Stare. He had looked into it and pushed back with something that was less than defiance, less deliberate than that, but more than submission. Reza was still standing when the wave broke and the survivors pulled back into the corridor structure, using the geography the way they had planned, feeding Ghost Rider multiple directions of approach and buying time with the only currency they had left, endurance. They did not win. Let that be stated clearly. The assault did not stop Ghost Rider. It did not injure him in any lasting way. It did not drive him from the city or alter his mission or introduce any new constraint on his operation. By every conventional military metric, it failed. But it demonstrated something that the Lycan Council had suspected and now had confirmation of. Ghost Rider was not perfectly efficient. He had dynamics. He had a relationship with the nature of his targets that introduced variation into his power. The Penance Stare was absolute, but absolute was not the same as instantaneous. There were delays. There were degrees. And in a world where the difference between living and dying often existed in the space of seconds and fractions of psychology, degrees were everything. The Lycans retreated to their deep chambers and reviewed what they had learned. It was not hope. They were too experienced for hope to function cleanly under these conditions. But it was information. And information in the hands of people who had survived as long as they had through nothing but their ability to use it well was the closest thing to hope available. There is a counterintuitive truth about very old conflicts. They are stable. Not peaceful. Stability and peace are different things, and anyone who has lived long enough understands that distinction viscerally. Stable means that the mechanisms are established, that the violence follows predictable channels, that both sides have learned the shape of the other's violence so thoroughly that the war itself becomes a kind of structure, terrible, relentless, genuinely destructive, but structured. And structure, however brutal, is something that civilizations can function around, can build inside of. The vampire-Lycan war had been this for centuries. Both factions knew the rules, even when they broke them. Both factions knew the stakes, the rhythms, the pressure points and the soft places, and the things that were forbidden even in this war, because crossing those lines would escalate it into something that neither side could control. They had fought each other with tremendous violence and tremendous discipline simultaneously, because the discipline was what kept the violence survivable for both of them across centuries. Ghost Rider did not know the rules. More precisely, Ghost Rider was not interested in the rules. The rules were human constructs, political constructs, constructs built by creatures negotiating their own survival. Ghost Rider operated from something that predated negotiation entirely. He arrived in the spaces where sin had accumulated and he answered it. The rules about what was forbidden, what was permitted, what lines existed in the centuries-old architecture of this war, none of it registered as relevant information. The vampire leadership structure took the first critical hit 3 weeks after Ghost Rider's arrival. Not the eldest, they had gone deep, retreating into the most inaccessible parts of their hierarchy and surrounding themselves, with enough layers of distance and misdirection to complicate even Ghost Rider's navigation. But the operational layer, the council members and command figures and senior death dealers who form the functional architecture of vampire authority in the city, took losses that the hierarchy could not easily absorb. 3 council members, 2 sector commanders, a significant number of the institutional knowledge that kept the Coven's complex operations coordinated and functional. What the vampires discovered when they lost these figures was something they had not fully appreciated while those figures lived. How much of their stability depended on specific individuals who had spent centuries building and maintaining specific relationships. Institutional memory. The informal networks of authority and communication that did not appear in any formal document but held everything together in practice. When Ghost Rider found these individuals and applied his judgment to them, He did not simply remove operational nodes from the structure. He removed the mortar that the stones were set in. The Lycans fared differently. Their structure was flatter, less dependent on specific individuals, more distributed across the collective. They lost significant people, fighters and strategists whose absence was genuinely felt, but the absence did not produce the same cascading structural failure. The Lycan faction weakened, but it remained coherent. The vampire faction began to fracture. And fracturing in an environment where two factions had maintained an adversarial equilibrium for centuries created something neither side had fully anticipated: a vacuum. Not a power vacuum in the political sense, though that too, but something more primal. A behavioral vacuum. The war had provided structure, and structure had provided a kind of order. And order had kept certain impulses, the older, less disciplined appetites of both sides, in check. Without the structure, those impulses found surface. Younger vampires, without council oversight, began feeding without discipline. Not the controlled, invisible predation that the hierarchy had regulated for centuries, the kind that kept the human world from noticing, but something more visible, more reckless, driven by the particular combination of fear and released constraint that characterized creatures who had lost their authority figures without losing their appetites. Lycans, reduced in number and operating under the sustained pressure of Ghost Rider's campaign, moved into areas of the city they had previously avoided out of strategic discipline. Territorial boundaries that had been maintained through centuries of careful negotiation, informal boundaries, unwritten but understood, began to dissolve. The city did not become safer because Ghost Rider was in it. The city became more dangerous. Not the structured, manageable danger of a war with rules, but the chaotic, unpredictable danger of a war coming apart. The shadows that had always contained the violence now had holes in them. Things that had been kept in the deep dark began to surface, not because they were stronger, but because the things that had kept them deep were compromised. Ghost Rider moved through it all, unchained. The chaos was not his concern. The judgment was his concern. But chaos, unlike structured violence, did not make itself available for judgment in organized, findable forms. It scattered. It proliferated. And in proliferating, it multiplied the demands on something that had come to this city for a reason, executing that reason with perfect commitment, and finding that the reason was reshaping itself faster than it could be addressed. The war was collapsing. And collapse, unlike defeat, did not end things. It spread them. Somewhere inside the fire, inside whatever passed for reflection in the consciousness of a being that was more principle than person, something shifted. It happened gradually, which was unusual. Ghost Rider was not by design a gradual thing. He was immediate. Arrival, judgment, consequence. The arc of his action was short and vertical. He came, he found, he rendered what the sin required. That was the structure of his existence in the world, the shape he moved in. Gradual was not part of the architecture, but this city was teaching him something. Or the spirit of vengeance, which was the deeper thing, the thing that wore Ghost Rider as a form, the way the ocean wears waves. The fundamental force of divine retribution that had existed before any of the names humans or immortals had given it was encountering a problem that individual judgment could not resolve, and in encountering it, was being changed by the encounter. The problem was structural. He had come for sinners, and the sinners were real. The guilt was real. The accumulated weight of centuries of predation and cruelty, and the particular kind of damage that immortal beings do to the world when they decide that their survival justifies everything that enables it. None of that was fabricated. None of it was ambiguous. The vampire elders carried sins that would have taken a human lifetime to catalog. Even the Lycans, whose guilt had a different texture, had done real damage across their centuries of war. But judgment, applied at the individual level in sufficient quantity, was not producing resolution. It was producing fragmentation. And fragmentation was not the same as justice. Justice implied a movement toward a state that was better than the one that preceded it, a correction, a restoration, something that left the world more ordered than it had been before the judgment arrived. What Ghost Rider was producing in the Underworld was not a movement toward a better state. It was a movement toward a more chaotic one. This was not a failure of power. His power was not in question. It was a failure of application, a mismatch between the scale of the judgment and the scale of the problem. He could judge individuals. He could judge hundreds of individuals. He could work through the population of this city's immortal community over time and find every sin and answer it, and leave nothing unanswered. But the war was not a collection of individual sins. The war was a system that had been generating sin for centuries, that had built sin into its operating logic, that could produce new sinners faster than any single force of judgment could process them. Could you judge a war? Not the warriors, the war itself. The structure that made the warriors what they were. The spirit of vengeance did not have a clean answer to this, and that absence of a clean answer was itself a kind of evolution. The power of divine retribution was not accustomed to operating in the space of unanswered questions. It was accustomed to the clarity of sin and consequence, the straightforwardness of wrong and punishment. Questions that complicated that clarity were not part of its known territory. And yet the city was more violent than it had been when he arrived, not less. The sinners he had judged were judged that was real, that was complete, that was not in question. But the system that produced them was still producing. The vampire hierarchy, disrupted and fractured, was not eliminated, it was destabilized, which was not the same thing. The Lycan resistance, tested and reduced but not broken, was adapting. The war was changing its shape around the judgment the way water changed its shape around an obstacle, not stopping, not being eliminated, but finding new paths. Selene's face appeared in whatever served as memory for this entity. The way she had stood in the street. The way she had not looked away from the Penance Stare. The weight of what he had seen in her was real centuries of sin, genuinely, undeniably real, but underneath it, something else. Something that resembled, without being quite the same as, a desire for a different outcome. Not innocent, she was too old and too honest with herself for innocence. But something adjacent to the will toward less cruelty. Something that recognized the difference between what she was and what the system demanded she be. The question that formed in the fire was one that the spirit of vengeance had never had to ask before, because it had never operated in a system complex enough to require asking it. Was judgment applied without end to an endless source justice? Or was it simply a different kind of perpetuation? In the last hours before dawn, Ghost Rider stopped, not permanently. Nothing about his nature was permanent in the sense of final rest. He would move again, he would find again, he would render judgment again. This was not an ending in the way that endings meant cessation. But he stopped, and in the stopping, the city held a breath that it had not known it was holding. He stood at the edge of the city's oldest district, where the streets were narrowest, and the buildings were oldest, and the dark was deepest. The hellfire burned around him without urgency, without the forward-leaning intensity of pursuit. It simply burned, the way a candle burns on a table when the room is still present, patient, and waiting for the next gust of wind to show it which way to lean. Both factions, from their respective distances and depths, watched and did not approach. The war still existed. Let that be said clearly, because clarity matters more than comfort at the end of a story like this one. The vampires still had their hierarchy, fractured and frightened and reorganizing itself around the shock of loss, but still present, still functional in the way that very old things remain functional even when significantly damaged. The Lycans still had their community, reduced in number and altered by what they had endured, but with a cohesion that Ghost Rider's campaign had not managed to fully dissolve. The shadows of the city still contained violence, still harbored the architecture of a centuries-old conflict that had no resolution on the horizon that either side could honestly describe as desirable. But the war was not the same. There is a specific change that occurs in a conflict when both sides have encountered something that neither of them is. Not an enemy. Enemies were useful. Enemies provided structure. Enemies defined you by opposition in a way that was, strange as it sounds, almost comfortable. Something else. Something outside the bilateral logic of the war entirely. Something that looked at both sides with the same eyes and found in both of them the same fundamental subject. The record of what they had done with their centuries. Both the vampires and the Lycans would rebuild. They would adapt. They were too old and too survival-oriented not to. They would find new structures, new hierarchies, new strategies. The war would continue, because wars like this one did not end through attrition, they ended through transformation. And transformation required conditions that a single campaign of judgment could not create. Ghost Rider had not ended the war. He had never claimed he would. He had come to answer sin, and he had answered it in every place he found it, with the perfect commitment of a force that did not tire, did not compromise, did not weigh the cost of its mission against the complexity of the outcome. What he had left behind was something harder to name than ending, something closer to a mark, a watermark pressed into the paper of this world's history. Both factions, going forward, would know something they had not known before his arrival, that the dark they controlled was not the only dark. That somewhere above their centuries of strategy and survival and mutual cruelty, there was a category of response that operated outside all of it. That sin, which they had treated as a private matter between themselves and their war, was apparently legible to something beyond them. This knowledge was not comforting. It was not meant to be comforting. The spirit of vengeance was not a comfort. It was a fact. An old fact, older than either faction, older than the war, older than the city or the darkness it sat in. A fact that the world periodically found reasons to make visible in ways that left marks that did not fade. Ghost Rider rode out of the city the way he had ridden in. Through the rain that had returned as it always returned in that city, soft and insistent and continuous. The hellfire did not dim in the rain. It never dimmed in the rain. The chain dragged sparks from the wet cobblestones, and the burning trail behind him illuminated the street for 30 seconds after he was gone, fading slowly, the way embers faded, not going out, but quieting. Waiting. In the tunnels beneath the city, in the chambers of the elders, in the fortified rooms of the Lycan war council, in the blood-dark architecture of the underworld that humans walked over every day without knowing it existed, the immortals sat with the silence that Ghost Rider had left behind. It was a different silence from the one that had preceded him. Denser, more aware of itself, because somewhere in the receding dark, beyond the edge of what any of them could follow, the fire still burned. It had not gone out. It had simply moved further down the road, carrying its judgment with it into other nights and other cities and other accumulated centuries of sin that the world had been quietly banking in the places it preferred not to examine. Ghost Rider did not finish. He continued, and somewhere in the deep knowing of every immortal that had survived his passage through their world, that fact sat like a stone in still water. The war would go on. The dark would remain. The blood feud between the ancient and the transformed, between aristocratic cruelty and feral endurance, would continue to write itself in the shadows of cities that humans walked through without understanding. But it would write itself now with one eye over its shoulder, looking for fire,